I want to just acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the unceded ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people who lived peacefully in this area of the Bay Area for thousands of years before the Spanish colonizers came and changed their way of life. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement. I'm going to give you a slice of this book that I just finished, which we published by Stanford University Press. It's a sneak preview of this book. It's not the kind of book historians normally write. We write what we call historical monographs for classroom instruction and for our colleagues. There are a few of us, not including me up to this point, that write for the public, right? You know about these historians, but I'd never done that before. This book originally was conceived as an academic study. It was going to be, after years of research, it was going to be a book about Compton. First and foremost, the academic study. But it changed, and it changed for a lot of reasons, and I think for the good. What are some of the reasons that it changed? That young man right there, Jackson Albert Camarillo. Stand up, Jackson. Look at that handsome boy. Grandson, one of 7 grandchildren. I wrote it for them because I wanted them to have a sense of this, the scope of history that encompasses my life, which they could not begin to understand. I could tell him stories, or he wouldn't listen to me anyway, right? But now he's going to have to read. I wrote it for Jackson and his cousins, and hopefully hundreds of thousands, if not in the future, millions of students, beginning in 2025, who will be taking a course in ethnic studies mandated for every high school student in the state of California to graduate. Beginning 25, the first class that will have that ethnic studies course, 2020. So I'm just hoping that some of the more inspirational stuff that's in this book will reach those students, and maybe, even if it just inspires one of them to pursue higher education, the transformation of higher education, which it did for all of us, certainly did for me, that mission accomplished, right? And then another reason, I wanted to leave a historical record of my generation of students of color in the state of California, but nationwide. We were the first to attend colleges and universities, especially Latino folks, right? Unlike our African-American colleagues and friends, many of them who had the privilege and the opportunity to go to historically black colleges, Latino folks did not, right? And so my generation was the first ever in a cohort of people. There had been a few that had gone to college in the 30s and 40s and 50s, but my cohort was the first. And so I'm leaving a record about that because it's largely unknown. Almost no one of my generation has written that memoir, right? So it's part of that. And then lastly, for you alums, right? And I see some familiar faces out there. It's to document how this amazing institution changed over time. Because when I got here in 1975, it was a very different institution. And we can all take pride of this university that led the charge on diversifying its student population. It took it seriously. It committed to institutional change. And so I want the students now and in the future to understand that change that occurred at Stanford, because my life is woven into that, right? Okay, so the roots, right? My life is embedded in this institution in a big way, because I was 26 years old when I came here as an acting assistant professor. And so nearly 50 years later, I've seen a lot that's gone on in this institution. And when I see the alums, it's amazing for me. I'm in contact with former students all the time. And I don't have to go very far to run into a Stanford alum and some people that are doing amazing things. For example, recently, earlier this month, I went to the 50th anniversary of the California Latino Legislative Caucus. 50th anniversary, big deal. A gala event in a beautiful classic theater in downtown Los Angeles. This organization, I was in graduate school in 1973, was formed. I knew a couple of the legislators back then. There were 5 of them, 5 Latinos in the state of California in the state legislature. And when I went to this event, there are 38 now, number grown significantly. Latinas are the majority of that population, and arguably the Latino caucus today is the most important caucus in the state legislature, shaping policy. That's a huge change. And of course, I go to these things, and who pops up? Javier Becerra. He took one of my first Chicano history classes I ever taught in 1976, and then went on to our law school right here. By the way, his daughter was my last advisee, honors thesis advisee before I retired. So it was that intergenerational stuff that was really beautiful. And Lorena Gonzalez, who was my advisee in the 90s, who was also in the state legislature. She was the chair of the caucus, and one of those legislators who was so committed and continues to be committed to the rights of workers in California. And then next to me is that gentleman there. That's family member, right? That's Greg, class of 06, mechanical engineering. But those of you that are football fans won't remember that. Remember, he was number 23. He played football here. Jax likes that. How did a Mexican kid with immigrant parents out of the barrio in Compton get to be a faculty member at Stanford University? I mean, it was a real rare thing, believe me, back then, right? Compton, this is 1962, those of you that can date those automobiles up there, right? Someone's shaking their head. Now, downtown Compton, pretty typical suburb, historical development of a suburb in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. People came to this farming community in the early 20th century. It goes actually back to the late 19th century as a municipality. And then people start coming, but it's still a small farming community right into the 20s, into the 30s. They come from the Midwest, a lot of folks. African Americans are beginning to move in substantial numbers to parts of Los Angeles in the 1930s, especially in the 1940s, and then the post-World War era. Mexican folks, like my father and my mother's family, were coming by the hundreds of thousands during the Mexican Revolution, those first 3 decades of the 20th century, and they were coming to Compton too, my roots. Compton, just so that you guys can locate it, in the heart of metropolitan Los Angeles. They used to call it the hub city, in fact, right? Sits right in the middle of the metropolitan area, and amazingly, people today think about Compton, they don't think about its agricultural roots, right? But not only Compton, but all of metropolitan LA through the 20s, through the 30s, until World War II, which changes things, the basic economy was agriculture, right? Family farms for the most part. They came literally by the hundreds of thousands in those decades before and after World War II because chasing the American dream, they were chasing the California dream, they were chasing the Los Angeles dream, right? And a lot of different folks came. Now, I was part of that. I wasn't the migrate. All right, now we'll have to, hold on a second. We'll do a collective, This is Albert in 1952. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. All right, let's get on with it here. This is our little house in the barrio. Beat the heck out of that house, my brothers and I. Look, there's not even a doorknob on that door. We knocked out the glass. My dad had to put this little screen, nail it on the door, but that was our home. We called it the backward house because it really was backward on the lot. It was a product of what I call Jaime Crow. Now, The analogy I'll use here, and you'll understand why, is that there was a virus in American society. It was called Jim Crow. It started in the South, and it affected white-black society. If you were black from birth to death, you were separate and you were unequal, right? It mutated. It mutated as hundreds of thousands of Mexicans came to the United States in those first 3 decades of the 20th century. And as Asian folks came in larger numbers, Filipino folks, it came to places like Texas and Arizona and California, and this mutation was Jaime Crow. And Jaime Crow, unlike Jim Crow was highly legalized, right? It was a legal structure, but it was supported by a cultural, social order, that's the way the things were. Jaime Crow was different. It wasn't, for the most part, with the exceptions of Texas, not codified in law, but it was still really powerful because it was social custom, right? This is the way it was supposed to be. Mexican folks aren't supposed to, for the most part, go to school with white folks. They're not supposed to live in the same place with white folks, and that's why the Compton barrio started. Because before 1940, blacks absolutely were not allowed. Absolutely not allowed to live in Compton. And there was 100,000 African Americans contained in South Central Los Angeles, just above that, right? Where I was born, Watts is the next community over, right? And then South Central Los Angeles. But Mexicans were allowed to live in one little portion of Compton, the barrio where I was born, right? We weren't large enough in number. There was only about 1,000 of us in this community. And, you know, it was an amazing little community. Well, we were all poor, right? Although we didn't think of ourselves as poor. But it was our social universe, right? So the little homies, Biggie, Papito, Luli, those are my homies. Those are my little vatos. They were my little companions. We ran around the barrio like little rats, scurrying around, getting into mischief, doing all kinds of things and having fun. But we had this network of family. Everywhere we went, there was a family member watching out for you, right? Or by what we call compadrazgo, or godparent relationship. So you couldn't get into too much mischief because people were looking after you, right? But that was an important part of it. My social universe was the barrio. The Gonzales market, the Gutierrez market, the tortilleria, the one barber shop, there were 2 liquor stores. And that was the place where we hung out, right? It was a segregated community because by 1920s, this is true of Compton, all of metropolitan Los Angeles, all of metropolitan America. The racial restrictive covenants. If you've ever seen one, it's usually at the end of the deed of sale, and it says these people, the following groups, cannot buy or rent property. And in Compton, it was Japanese and Mexicans. Those were the 2 groups specified. And there was only one area, that little Compton barrio, where you could live if you were of Mexican origin. Remember this particular slide, because by 1962, the segregationists say, all right, we got a problem on the west side. There are a lot of black folks, and there are Mexican folks, and we're going to keep East Compton white. All right, so this is part of the narrative. Okay. We live next to the church, the little chapel, built in the 1920s. It was a Mexican chapel because we couldn't go to the white Catholic church in East Compton. So they built the little Mexican chapel right next to my grandmother, and we were next to my grandmother. And then the church, tiny chapel. This room, all right, so just to give you an idea how big the chapel was, from this part of the room over, that was it for the Mexican church, right? And then the church decides to build a bigger church. Well, they take the property where our house is, and we got to move, right? So my mother's actually happy to get out of the old backward house and move to a different part of Compton. And, I'm 9 years old. I'm Jax's age, and we're ready to move, right? Because I remember one day, story, give you an idea of Jaime Crow. So my dad's excited, you know, we're selling the house. The church buys our property for a whopping $7,000. And he wants to build his own home. He's a construction guy, right? He knows how to do this stuff. He was a concrete man, a cement mason. And so we look for a lot, and he takes us to this lot. And of course, I have no conception of what's going on, but I go with my mom and dad, and we go into Linwood. Rayford, you remember where Linwood is? Well, Linwood was an all-white community, absolutely all-white community. And my dad went into the real estate office to inquire about the lot, and then immediately came, within seconds, you know, it seemed like within a minute, came back to the car, and he was quiet. And I wondered what was going on. Only later did I hear, after my father died, that my mother told us the story. He went in to the Linwood realtor, and the man was polite, but he made it very clear. He said, "Sir, I'm sorry, we don't sell property to Mexicans in Linwood." But okay, we moved to Richland Farms, south. Oops, let me go back on that. Richland Farms, an area of Compton. It's hard for you to believe, and Rayford, who's from Compton, will remember this. There was a portion of South Compton, which bordered South Compton, which at the time when I was growing up was the largest undeveloped piece of real estate in all of southern Los Angeles County. And it was farmland. That's what they call Richland Farms. So when I tell people I lived in Richland Farms, they're like, farms in Compton? Yeah. But Compton, in West Compton, still was predominantly white. This is the third grade. I moved to the third grade, right? I'm not a good student. Jax, don't listen to this. I was not a good student. I didn't like school. You know, every opportunity I had a stomach ache, I'd stay home. But, you know, my mom got wise to it. We called her La Jefita because she was the boss in the family. This was a school on the west side. It didn't stay that long, didn't stay this way very long. So there's Mexican kids in this school, and I remember that only a couple black kids. But what happens in the next few years is unbelievable. People refer to it as white flight. Not in Compton. I call it white exodus. Unbelievable turnover of West Compton, because African Americans, for the first time in the late 40s and early 1950s, are able to crack the real estate barrier in Compton. And it was amazing for a while. You had doctors and lawyers and workers in the oil fields, and so stable working class people and black professional folks moving into Compton. And believe me, I've talked to a lot of these folks. I knew them. I knew some of them. And this was an amazing dream for them to break into Compton, because Compton was, in their eyes, they had achieved the American dream of moving into Compton, right? And for a short time, not too long, I got to see this transformation. By the 8th grade, my junior high school was overwhelmingly African American, right? So I had gone from a barrio to South Compton that was in the process of transformation, demographic transformation. I had white friends, I had Mexican friends, I had Asian friends, I had Filipino friends, and now my world turns black. My music, Motown, of course, right? R&B. My teammates are black. The girl I like is black. We go to the dances, you know, we're dancing. There aren't too many non-blacks left, right, by the time I graduate. But it gave me a sense, you know, when I look back on it, and this experience in Compton, not until I was an adult, not until I went to UCLA, not until I truly understood how profoundly I was shaped by that multiracial experience in Compton, right? And thank goodness I had that experience. My sister, my oldest sister, Rita, I love her. You know, she was 17 years older than me, kind of the boss of the family. She did a lot for the family. Went into banking when Mexican-American women didn't go into banking, right, in the 40s and 50s. And then she went into real estate. But my sister, now, those of you that understand this, in large families, families of color, there are some that are very light complected, and then some are very dark. And that's in my family. Rita was the lightest. She could pass. She always passed, right? And she enjoyed passing. And then I had some brothers that were very dark, and I'm kind of in between, right? Well, Rita was part of that generation that really bought into the assimilation model and kind of rejected a lot of the things about being an ethnic woman, right? She was concerned. I only found out later, years later, right, why my dad decided to move when she came to him and said, you know, there's some Negroes that are beginning to move into the neighborhood, and your property values are going to go down. And my dad, you know, he never spent one day in a classroom. Smart guy, right? He was a smart guy. He figured it out. He worked his way up. He bought a home. Right? He bought a couple homes. But he believed her, right? You know what the reason was, though? And Rita, she shared it later, and my parents, I was too black. My friends were black. My culture was becoming African American, and she didn't want me to be with black people. So what do? We moved to East Compton. On the fringe of East Compton, I go to the segregated high school. Not one black person in that school. Not one. Few Mexican folks, about 30, 40 Mexican folks, 2 Asian American kids. So remember that map I showed you where the realtors in 1962 decided we're going to hold the line right at Alameda Street and the Southern Pacific Railroad line, the physical barrier. That West Compton will be black and Mexican, and East Compton's going to stay white. Well, that didn't stay long because things were changing. So I go to the white high school, but I use sports because I'm into sports now, right? So I use sports as a football player to kind of navigate my way in, and I'm making friends. But, you know, I didn't know anyone there. 2 weeks into my sophomore, 2 weeks into being at Dominguez High School, I get a summons from the vice principal in class. So the teacher says, you know, Mr. Joseph wants you in talk with you. I said, oh shit, what did I do? I didn't do anything. No, I was not the greatest student, but I didn't do anything. So he sits me down. He says, Al, we know. So I had gotten some recognition. So I was Mr. Brotherhood at Walton Junior High School, right, when they initiated this idea of racial harmony, right? They were trying to promote that. So Miss Brotherhood. I was the Compton Optimus Boy of the month towards the end of my 9th grade at Walton, particularly because they knew that I was able to make friends with a lot of different people across cultures and race and ethnicity. So he says, we think, this really floored me. My leg was shaking, because when I get nervous, my legs shake. And so I'm sitting there, and Mr. Joe said, we think you should run for sophomore class president. Well, one, I was relieved, because I thought he was going to try to pin something on me that I didn't do. As the vice principal, that's what they do. And I said, Mr. Joe, I don't know anyone here. They don't know me. I'm from the West Side. He said, but we think you, because I was a student leader at Walton by the time, the 8th and 9th grade. So we think you should run for sophomore. I ran for sophomore president and I won. I think should I say it? Did they mess around with the election? So I'm student body president. I liked it. It was fun, right? I was student body president by the time I was a senior, the first non-white to hold that position. At the time, the Compton Unified School District decides it's time to integrate. And then what do? They start busing the black kids in over. And though there had been, a handful of African-American kids my junior year, senior year, when they started to bus the kids in, many of whom I knew because they were from Walton. They were 7th graders when I was a 9th grade leader at that school, right? And a football player, a basketball, and all that stuff. Hell breaks out, fights every day. So the administration decides to create a human relations council to calm things down. They asked me, I'm 17 years old. I don't know anything about it. They asked me to be the chair of this group to help ameliorate some of the issues that the boys were fighting, Imagine the boys, not the girls, the boys were fighting. And, I stepped into that role, and it gave me the perspective for the first time of how virulent racial attitudes could be, because there was a lot of hate. Of the white kids, there was a group of white kids at the school. We called them the dumb surfer boys. They were really the ones instigating the fights, right? So we got through that, but it also showed me something very important in life, right, later. Look at Compton's population. I can't get into Compton today because I'll run out of time. I have a ton of stuff on Compton in this book, right, because it is about Compton. I went back to Compton years, and my son Jeff here taught there for a number of years. One of the reasons I went back there to try to understand the community of origins, right? But Latinos are the red line. Today, that place is a very different place. It's about 80%, 75 to 80% Latino African-American population, 17, 19% Pacific Islander. But I can't get into that. But I was off to UCLA, right? Man, I was excited because I was a basketball player, right? And go to UCLA, woo, man, was that fun. This is pre-affirmative action, right? Pre-affirmative action. I started there in 1966, and I remember sitting down one day, kind of lonely. I didn't have many friends, had basketball friends. I'll get to that in a second. And I remember reading an article in the Daily Bruin. First article, I think, of its kind, was talking about Mexican Americans, and there were fewer than 50 Mexican Americans out of 28,000 students. Right? There were about 100 black kids. I knew several of them because they were on the sports teams. There was a subset of maybe 100, 150 Asian Americans, but this is pre-affirmative action UCLA. You want to see? So I tried out for the UCLA basketball team, and I made it. This is the freshman squad, 1966. It doesn't have an African American on it. The unbelievably talented varsity squad only had 3 African Americans. That's how non-diverse this huge public institution was in the mid-1960s. Within a 30-mile radius, you had 600,000 African Americans. You had 650,000 Mexican Americans and other Latinos, predominantly Mexican origin. And this amazing school had fewer than a couple hundred of them, right? But that began to change. That began to change. When we think about today's tumultuous times, I'm always thinking about UCLA in my life, the LA, the nation, in this tumultuous period, post-civil rights movement, assassination of some of our amazing leaders, the inner cities of America were burning. There was an anti-war movement, a horrible war in Southeast Asia, which we, as a lot of us, you had to take a stand back then, right? And my stand was clearly moving to a way more progressive political stance, right? I was affected by the black movement, the Chicano movement. When these kids here, 1968, 20,000 of them move out of the East LA schools because of all the inopportunity, the lack of resources, the terrible education, and they said no more. There was a Chicano movement, an anti-war movement. It's brewing, right? And it's hitting campuses big time. Oh, by the way, I should back up here a second here. Just a second. You see that guy right above me where the arrow is? So one day, I'm a freshman. And I drop him off at his apartment. I go, he invites us in the apartment, and we go in there. There's a pretty girl sleeping on his couch over here. And I walk in, I say, John, man, you come in here after practice, you got a pretty girl laying on your couch here waiting for you. I said, sign me up. That was a fateful day in my life. Because when she woke up, it was that young woman right there. And he said, oh, that's the girlfriend of my best friend. He goes to San Francisco State. I said, aha. And the other thing, too, she was an A student. I was struggling. I was on academic probation, end of my first year, right? I was that close to failing out of UCLA. I didn't know how to study. Man, she studied all the time, right? So I learned from her, and then she became my editor for all my papers. She edited this book. Okay. Had to get that in. All right. Things are changing. I'm changing. I take the first African-American Studies class ever offered at a University of California system school. I took the first Chicano history course ever offered in the University of California system. And man, it was like a light went on in my head. For the first time, there's a history of my people. There's a history about black folks that I never read in high school, and Asian folks, and I was enthralled, right? I wanted more. And some of these people helped me. Juan Gomez Quindon is really one of the fathers of Chicano history. I was a junior and senior when he was an acting assistant professor. I didn't even know. I called him profe or professor, but he was an acting assistant. He was a graduate student, right? And he took me under the wing, as did this other fellow, Norris Hunley, historian at UCLA. That's Ralph Bunch, by the way. So the building, we used to call it the Waffle Building right there. You can see why it's good. And Ralph Bunch, right, a famous African-American alum of UCLA, Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1950. By the way, you know why he won the Nobel Peace Prize? This man brokered the armistice between the Palestinians and the Israelis in 1949 or 1950, right? He's with us again. All right, and I know Susan's going to say, don't tell this story. Does everyone know who this guy is here? All right, so we practice every day with the varsity, right? Sometimes we had to scrimmage these guys. He's a giant, right? And that team was unbelievably good. So one day, I'll just share that. I know that. One day, we're at practice, and Kareem, we used to call him Big Lou, because his name was Lou Alcindor back then, right? So he comes out to practice, and I'm out about 20 feet out on where the perimeter, where you get your three-point shot today. Don't do that now. I mean, back then, today is a three-point line. And Lou's coming. I say, Lou, I said, we little guys, we got to shoot from way back here, man. And you giants, you get to lay the ball into the hoop. So I throw him the ball, and he catches. He's about 17 feet on the baseline. Basket's right there. He looks at me, takes the ball, swish. Freshman squad, we go crazy, right? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar made one three-point basket in his entire illustrious NBA career. Who taught him how to shoot that shot? See, you see why she doesn't want me to tell us? All right, so I'm on the ground floor of creating a new history about a people that numbers in the millions throughout the Southwest and parts of the Midwest, and we're creating a new field of study. And that allows me to have opportunity that I couldn't have imagined when I was growing up, right? But wait a minute, 3 strikes and you're out? First strike. I was looking for a basketball scholarship when I was a senior, and one of the stars on the basketball team the year before me, 2 years before me, ended up playing for Stanford. I said, and Stanford had a horrible team. So I figured I could play for a bad team, maybe a scholarship. So I write a letter with the coaches, my coaches' support, and got a very quick reply from Howie Delmar, the coach, and he says, thank you for your letter, but I've shared your transcripts with the admissions office and no go. I was a good student. I wasn't a great student. So strike one. Strike two. Susan and I drive up here for a huge anti-war rally in 1970 in San Francisco, and I had made an appointment to come talk with one of the historians in our history department here, because I was thinking about applying to Stanford's graduate program. I said graduate school was already in my head by that time, right? And I met with this guy, George Knowles, a kindly old gentleman. I got to know him after I joined the faculty. And I remember the conversation explicitly, because I said, Professor Knowles, I'm thinking about Stanford. I'd like to study Chicano history. And you could see Chicano history. He said, what is it that you want to study? And then I got it, Mexican-American history. He says, son, stay at UCLA. If you want to study slavery with Carl Degler, then you should apply. So I was mad. I was mad as hell. But he was right. I stayed at UCLA, and it was better for me. 2 strikes. I get a call from Stanford. Is it going to be strike 3? I apply for this, and there wasn't a whole lot of competition, right? But the bigger question for me, could I survive at a place like this? Right? There were 4 Mexican Americans on the faculty that time and about 4 or 5 African Americans. This is the beginning of affirmative action. I'm an affirmative action baby, folks, and I'm damn proud of it, because had it not been for that federal policy enacted like places like Stanford and institutions across the land, we would have never had a chance to be here. And all we wanted was a chance to be here, right? Just a chance to make it. And I was going to make the most of it. There's no way I was going to strike out 3 times, although I have to tell you, early years of being an assistant professor and knowing what I had to do, get the books out, the articles, and teach, right? And teach pretty well. Could you make it here? Early on, assistant professor, it's sink or swim. So you better publish. You better be a pretty good teacher. I took that seriously, and for me, it was amazing, because I had these students. And they were thirsting for the kind of knowledge that I was producing and other people were producing about race and ethnicity in American society. And I could meet them, and I could see where they were going, right? And that was amazing. And I made the connections with not only with a whole bunch of students, I'll show you a picture of them in a second, but early on, by the time I knew I was going to get tenure, I knew that the only way to really have an impact at Stanford was to create institutions that would last, right? So Stanford Center for Chicano Research, no sooner than I got tenure, we created a Center for Chicano Research, the only such university at a center at a private university in 1980. And then other things that followed, and I'll talk about them briefly. But what was so special for me? By the 80s, I could begin to see the impact of the diversification of the student body. And for me, it was such a beautiful thing to see this variety, a multicultural, multiracial group of undergraduates, less so at the graduate level, but whether they were at Ujima or Casa Zapata, there's some Zapatista here, Casa Zapata up there, an Asian American Activity Center or Native American Cultural Center, or where Susan and I were the first resident fellows in Murray House in 1983. We saw in real time the beauty of people being able to understand one another, get along with one another, make friends. Some of them are married, right? They have children, multiracial children, and all kinds of cultural, multiracial bonding. That was special, right? And that always motivated me. But it also led to some difficult issues, right? The Stanford family was also a dysfunctional family at times, and I was in the thick of this stuff. This photo here goes to, on the far left, 1968, when the African-American students took over a forum on race. It was a forum about, in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. They took over the podium, and they took the mic, as it's called, and they demanded change. And part of that change, or many changes, was the creation of the program of African-American Studies. By the way, another change, if you see it up on this far right, Black Lives Matter, in January, that program will become the Department of African and African-American Studies. And that's a huge institutional development. I was caught also in the late 80s when there were all kinds of racial incidents that occurred that blew up on campus. And Don Kennedy, the president at that time, and Jim Ross, I was only 39 years old, and I was trying to publish the next book to get to that next level. And they asked me to chair this huge university committee called the University Committee on Minority Issues, which I did in a year and a half of my time. But I knew that it was critical because here was one of those moments of a crisis at the university that something positive could come out of it, right? And with that huge report, 250-page report, it was a book that we published, basically. It laid the infrastructure for the institutional programs that we now have at the university, because the university was serious about becoming a better multicultural institution of higher education. I don't have time. I'll mention this one here because this is important. In 1994, a group of Chicano students hunger strike, because their beloved mentor, Cecilia Burciaga, is fired by the university, and they are protesting. Right? And one of the things they're calling for is a Chicano studies program. There was no formal Chicano studies at the time. But in the end, with the faculty pushing it along the way, it became the Center for Comparative Studies for Race and Ethnicity, which I was asked to serve as the founding director of. So along the way, the institutions were built that made this place different and better, right? And in the book, of course, I talk a lot about that. So I'm going to end on that note and basically say that this journey of which, maybe almost 50 years at this institution, I've seen institutional change. I've seen stories. I mean, I can tell you stories that are the best of us as a nation, as a people, as institutions that can change. And I can also tell you those stories that tell us we're the worst of who we are as humans. And we see that all the time. We're seeing it so horribly right now in other parts of the world, but in our country as well. But you know what? I'll end on this. I end the book with stories of inspiration about Compton, about the people I met there, about the people I met here, about my students that have gone on to do amazing things. They're at institutions across the country. The leading people, some of them the leading people in their fields, right? And that's change. And for me, whenever I think of that, when I see you guys, and those of you that were in my classes and that I knew, that always gives me inspiration. And I appreciate you being here, and I hope that you got a little sneak preview of what's in this book. Thank you.